grandma has this dress.
No, neither.
I feel like Harry Potter. Too librarian. Too Bono?
No.
No. No. Big no.
Yes.
I look a little bit like a bumblebee. How long you been in these parts?
Blah, if sadness had a color. I bought this? Your Honor, I object.
No. This is so much like my dad.
That is the ticket.
Support for KQED Live comes from Berkeley Rep and the San Francisco Symphony.
Disproportionate impact of
more than half of Black business owners,
and disproportionate.
Somehow we always find a way to rise.
To the blueprint builders, to the backbones of every block, for the curators of the culture, and for generations to follow. You might fall, but never fail. Keep rising, keep rising, keep rising. Apply for business, marketing, and tech makeovers on us.
Hi, everyone. Good evening and welcome. My name is Ryan Davis. I'm the Executive Director here at KQED Live. And KQED Live is the live events programming series of your favorite local public media station here at KQED. We are dedicated to bringing journalism to life on stage, amplifying local culture, and deepening civic participation. And we do it through talks, performances, screenings, food tastings and demonstrations, interactive experiences, and thoughtful conversations like tonight's interview with Willie Brown. I would like to begin by thanking our seasoned sponsors that make programming like tonight possible. They are the Asian Art Museum, Berkeley Rep, Comcast Business, and the San Francisco Symphony, and we're very grateful for their commitment to supporting our mission of civic and cultural engagement. And I would like to thank all of you that are our members here at KQED for your support. That makes up the vast majority of our financial model here at KQED. It keeps our lights on. And if you're not yet a member, you can always join by visiting kqed.org/donate. And now, before we get started, I also want to encourage you to attend one of our upcoming events. On May 18th, we're partnering with the Center for Asian American Media as a part of CAMFest to host an evening called A Soy Story. It's an evening of storytelling and food tastings, exploring the soybean, a humble but very versatile staple of our diets, through the families who grow and sustain this crop here in California. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage our hosts tonight, our senior editor for politics and government and our politics correspondent, Scott Shafer and Marisa Lagos, the hosts of Political Breakdown.
Thank you, Ryan. Good evening, everyone. I'm Marisa Lagos.
And I'm Scott Shafer, and thanks so much for coming out for this live edition of Political Breakdown, a conversation with Willie Brown.
So Willie Brown is probably a familiar name to everybody. He is one of the few people in the history of California politics who really understands how not only to get power, but how to keep it.
Absolutely. He was born in segregated Mineola, Texas, 89 years ago. Came to San Francisco in 1951. He was the first black person sent to the state legislature to represent San Francisco, served as speaker longer than anybody else in California history, and 2 terms as mayor of San Francisco as well.
Please welcome to the stage Mayor Willie Brown. Thanks for being here, Mr. Mayor.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Well, we have a lot to talk with
We do.
you about because you've been around for 89 years, and most of those years are pretty interesting. You grew up in Mineola, Texas, which I think is about an hour and a half east of Dallas. What did it have going for it?
Almost nothing. It's a terrible little town, 4,500 people. It advertises itself as being the pinto bean capital of America. And that's because we grew pinto beans. But we grew a lot of other things too. But it was also the place where you could, in spite of the fact that the county was dry, Mineola was one of the few places that didn't get the message.
And that was in part thanks to your family, I believe. Your uncles ran a little speakeasy, right?
No, that was my grandmother. It really was my grandmother.
Yeah. Tell us about her.
She ran everything.
She ran everything, right?
She
Tell
ran
us about
everything.
her.
She was quite a woman.
Yeah.
Quite a woman. She was part Indian, originally I think from Oklahoma, and she looked the part, with the braids and statue, etc. But she was very much into running businesses, and so yes, there was a joint called the Shack, and she also had probably the only body in Mineola that had an underground space under the house, and that's where the alcohol beverages were. They called them chalk. They were, bootleggers.
Yeah.
And she had an arrangement apparently with the authorities.
Interesting.
Well, we were never raided.
Never got raided. That's nice. Was there
Never raided.
Yeah. How did that happen? How did that not happen?
Well, I think that they probably projected that the youngest son, grandson, would go on to become.
Would also not get raided.
And you can't have that kind of stuff on your record.
We'll come back to that.
We'll get back. Yeah, we'll get back to that. Exactly. Well, we mentioned at the top. I mean, at the time you grew up, this was a segregated town. I think that part of Texas was more like the South than the Southwest. And then we have a photo here of when you were graduating from high school in the center. But, I mean, it was also a very
I weighed about 120 pounds. I was the shortest kid in a class of about 13 people. I was shorter than everybody, all the girls, everybody. It was terrible. But, I graduated. I often tell people, hey, I graduated from high school, yes. And I finished second in my class. But I never tell people there were only 13 people. Because, you got hundreds of people out here in California graduated from high school.
The town was segregated. And
very segregated.
Yeah.
It was more than segregated. It was an enforced arrangement, literally. And it was like you didn't ever have any problem with the cops, the sheriff, the higher sheriff, arresting anybody. He'd simply tell my grandmother who they wanted to see. And she'd send them.
Wow.
So there never would have been an arrest arrangement.
We're going to give you a handheld mic just to make sure everybody can hear you.
You can't hear me?
Yeah?
You can hear me there?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Just a suggestion, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I know, this was a town, there was a lot of violence, often, against black people. There was a summer, I believe, in 1944, where a white man was killed after two white men assaulted two black men. And you've talked about that in the past. Can you just talk about how that experience, living in this place, often being treated like a second-class citizen, but you got out. Like, how did that inform the way you thought later when you got into the political arena?
Well, let me tell you that the Collins family in Mineola
It's your grandmother's side.
was a little different from the other black families in Mineola. because the grandmother had an arrangement of some sort. I think she may even have had an affair with the higher sheriff on a regular basis, because there never was any application of anything with reference to the Anna Lee Collins family. Her name was Anna Lee Collins. My mother was named originally Minnie Collins. And we didn't have the same kind of confrontations based strictly on race. And the white people in Mineola didn't seemed as hostile as white people in Houston, Gladewater, Longview, Houston, and all the other places that we would interact with, because I think it was because it was so small, and almost every black person in Mineola worked somewhere for white people. And as a result of that, there was, I think, less tension between whites and blacks in Mineola than in almost any other place in Texas that I was familiar with.
But to Marisa's point, I mean, you did witness other people in other places and the segregation and the racism. Did you bring that with you to San Francisco in terms
No, not at all.
Not at all?
Not at all. I didn't bring it with me. I was frankly shocked when I began to encounter some evidence of people being treated differently on the basis of race. And it was not just black folk. It was the Asians, the Latinos, and the Pacific Islanders, and the people that I came to know as life unfolded for me in San Francisco. And it was when it was only black and whites in Mineola, black and whites in Mineola, and practically everybody knew everybody else. You know who everybody worked for, you know where they lived, you know what they did, you know what their families were, etc., and you know what they were going to get into, so to speak, because they sometimes invited you. So it was a little bit different. But here, it was clear that there was a distinct separation between people on a race basis.
More so here in San Francisco.
Separated in the sense of treatment. Physical separation was greater in Mineola because you were on your side of town and white people were on their side of town. You did not go into the front door of any hotel, or you didn't go into the bar. You could do that in San Francisco, but you couldn't do it there. But the treatment was, I must tell you, rather alarming for me for San Francisco.
Yeah.
So you came out here in 1951. You went to San Francisco State. You went
August 4th.
August 4th.
51.
Pulled into town. Your uncle Itzy lived here already. But I want to jump forward a few years. So you end up going to law school. And when you get out, I think you found that the clientele you could attract was not necessarily what some of your white counterparts at the law school. Tell us about your early law career. Who are you defending?
Well, I ended up having to accept office space with a guy named Terry Francois. Terry Francois was, I think, the first black elected official ever in San Francisco. He was on the Board of Supervisors. He may have been appointed. I don't recall whether or not he got directly elected, but I think he was appointed. And when I graduated from law school, I got a job, I got selected to be a clerk. Oliver Carter, a federal judge here. Unprecedented, no precedent for it at all, for a black person becoming an assistant to a judge. Well, it so happens that before the bar results came back, Oliver Carter died. And so all the great plans that I had to become a justice went right out the window, because I literally had to go to work anyway, and there was no job. Black lawyers could not get jobs. No firm hired black lawyers. That was out of the question. Offered you a partnership, anything of that nature. But he offered me a space in his office, and he said, it's in the Fillmore on Sutter Street, 2085 Sutter. He said, and you know, you'll have to try to talk to the preachers and the doctors and all the other black people in and around San Francisco, because your clientele will be black if you get any. Well, I accepted the opportunity to take the office space that he had at no cost to me initially. The first day, he tells me that there is a case that he can't go on involving a husband and a wife, and I should go down and handle that. Didn't know whether or not to bring me any money. I went down to represent the wife. And lo and behold, the husband was a guy I came to become friendly with, and I actually said his goodbye at his funeral about a year ago. A guy named Charlie Walker. I represented his wife on behalf of my senior lawyer in the office, and Charlie Walker, literally while the judge was talking and carrying on, Charlie Walker was telling me what he was going to do to me when this case is over. And I, of course, responded appropriately to him. And the judge interrupted us both and said, Mr. Brown, I know you're new at this, but you really don't, you cannot engage in conversations with your opponent. I said, well, he's threatening me. So the judge said, well, I don't want to hear any more about this. Why don't we take a recess? And said to his lawyer, well, why don't you guys go outside and talk? So we go out in the hallway. And as soon as we get in the hallway, at that time, the courtrooms were in City Hall. I got them out of City Hall, but they were in City Hall. And so we go out in the hallway, and Charlie Walker comes over to me and says, man, what's the matter with you? I said, what do you mean, what's the matter with me? You were threatening me. He says, you know I didn't mean that. So what do you mean you didn't mean that? He said, you know, you're new at this. And he started telling me about what he does and how he does things and whatever you. So I said, let me tell you something. That judge is going to give you unholy hell. Your wife is going to get everything she wants, because I'm going to make the request, I'm going to make the plea, and I can do it. And so if I were you, I'd stop talking to me. I think you ought to go talk to her and see if you can't convince her, the two of you ought to settle this and keep all of us out of it. No. And he did. He went over and he talked to Ann, and sure enough, we went back in the court and told the judge that there's apparently been a reconciliation between the two parties, etc. And believe it or not, it was Ann, all these years later, when he died, who called me and said, you got to say good words about Charlie.
They stayed together?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow. Willie Brown, marriage counselor. Who knew?
So you, early in your law career, you represented some other women.
Well, I'm going to go on to that. Because meeting Charlie Walker was important. Because Charlie invited me to come visit the place where my uncle had occasionally had me hang out.
Uncle Itzy.
Uncle Itzy. And during the course of conversation with Charlie, he said, hey, why, you know, all these guys got his women working the streets. He said, I don't have any work in the streets, but I think you can make good money representing them, the women on the streets.
And you had a pretty
So
novel
I
defense.
became a lawyer, got one client, and in the courtroom, there was a judge who was a very good judge, smart guy, a Republican judge, believe it or not. And I went to court with this one client, woman, and I was like maybe 7 or 8 down the line of people called for your clients. And the guy had a laundry list, and it was the hookers court. And they had all these other lawyers, experienced lawyers, representing the hookers. And each one of these guys representing the hookers never, and I thought, understood the Constitution. Because every person registered for engaging in that kind of conduct was a woman being prosecuted, and no males. And you can't do that by yourself. You know, to my knowledge.
Takes two.
And,
Takes two to tango.
yeah, and so when they got to me, of course, I stood up and said that, Your Honor, I wish to impose a motion for selective prosecution, and that would be unconstitutional because my client was being treated differently than the guy she engaged with. The district attorney said, Your Honor, Mr. Brown is new and at this, and so just a minute. His name was Clayton Horn. He said, Mr. Brown is right. There have been 6 or 7 people, and not once did I see any man. And said, explain to me why that is. So this district attorney named Art Shafer said, well, Your Honor, you know, Mr. Brown is just playing a game. He said, no, that motion on selective prosecution is an important motion. And I think that, Mr. Shafer, we ought to put this over one day so you can get prepared, because I assume Mr. Brown is really prepared. So sure enough, walked out of the courtroom, and every other hooker immediately with their pimps came over and wanted to know if I would represent them, because clearly I'd done something different than anybody else had ever done. And of course, the district attorney's office, treated me like I was a nothing, because the next day they were not prepared. And Clayton Horn dismissed the case against my client. And from that moment on, I had found a way to make a living.
Well, you did parlay your legal skills also into defending a lot of protesters who were staging protests against
Well, that was much later.
businesses that
And they didn't pay.
they did not pay. But so I want to pull up another photo. This is you with now Senator Dianne Feinstein. This is years later than the time we're talking about. But you first met her because you were staging a protest of your own, right?
Well, I met Senator Feinstein. She was pushing, I guess you call it a buggy, with kids, with a daughter,
stroller, yeah.
with Catherine in it. And it was the Sunday after the Saturday that I had gone to 301 Christopher Drive up in Forest Hills. My wife, Blanche, and a girlfriend of hers had gone up to take a look at the model home. And they got there, and the people would not show them the model home. And my wife and her girlfriend were pretty aggressive. Girlfriend was a connected to the NAACP, and in the Blanche was connected with me, and the combination of that caused them not to leave the living room of the home that was to be shown. The people showing the home left and went outside and stood somewhere across the street. But there was a telephone there, and Blanche used the telephone to find me. And Everett Brandon, the woman, incidentally, Everett Brandon's daughter, I think, is now the chair of the Port Commission. Oh. Her name is Kimberly Brandon. I appointed her to the Port Commission back in 1996. But at any rate, they reached us. Everett and I were, he was a guy in NAACP. So we came to them and decided that we'll stay in that place until it was time to close. And sure enough, at some point, late in the afternoon, they closed it, and we let them know we'd be back tomorrow because Everett knew all of the techniques of doing that. And with that, he said, "Do you have any white friends?" "Yes, I do have a couple of white friends." One of the white friends was Sue Bierman, who was married to Art Bierman, who had been a professor out at SF State for me. Council for Civic Unity was an organization that was concerned about the treatment of people in the city on the basis of race. And with that telephone network that they had, the next day, which was Sunday, we showed up. Of course, they didn't reopen the house to show to anybody, but Everett had made sure that everybody who knew anything about press would be present. And pushing that buggy, Diane, Sue Bierman, got connected through the Council for Civic Unity and what have you. That's how I met Dianne Feinstein.
Well, and you obviously have maintained that relationship and friendship with her.
I've chaired, co-chaired every campaign Dianne has ever been in.
Yeah, and
every one of them.
And we want to come back to her, I think, in a bit. But you two seem like she seemed like an unlikely person to show up at a race, NAACP protest, because she's kind of Pacific Heightsy, and she has that image of being, not necessarily of the people. Do people get that wrong about her?
Well, first and foremost, Dianne was married to a guy named Jack Berman. She had 3 husbands, but Jack was the first one. Jack was the father of Kathy, who ultimately became a judge. I appointed Jack to the bench through Jerry Brown many years ago. Jack and Dianne, because Jack was a hangouter, gambler, drove a red convertible Cadillac. He was like, the cat's meow, and that marriage ended fairly quickly. But the friendship with Dianne started from pushing the buggy. When she ran for the first time in '69, after being appointed, I think, to one of the parole boards or some similar organization by then the Governor Brown, Elder Brown, she decided she wanted to do something in public life. And she decided to run for supervisor, unprecedented, literally, for a woman to be running. And in those days, it was citywide, which is really the way it ought to be. You ought to be elected citywide. You were elected citywide, whoever got the most votes became the chair of the Board of Supervisors, because that person needed to be in a position, if something happened to the mayor, to become the mayor, period. Dianne won that race for first place. I chaired the campaign. I was the only elected official that endorsed Diane's candidacy, period, for that job. And that relationship lasts to this minute. And I anticipate that you'll all read tomorrow that Diane is back in Washington. And I hope that she is able to go in and help Biden out.
Yeah. We have a photo of you. You run for the Assembly in 1962, and you lose.
I lost.
Narrowly. Come back.
Lost by about 1,000 votes.
Okay, to an incumbent?
To a 22-year incumbent. And when I lost, it was, in my opinion, because people didn't get to know me, not enough. So I learned I'd lost on that Tuesday night. In those days, you could actually count the votes. You didn't wait 3 weeks or any of that nonsense. And so by that Wednesday, it was literally clear to me that if I wanted to win an election anytime, I'd better go meet every voter in San Francisco in that district. And so what I did was I went as if the election was still going on. I ring your doorbell and thank you very much for voting for me. I had no idea whether you did or not. It didn't matter. But I knew that you would be nice enough not to hurt my feelings by saying, I didn't vote for you. I lost by 1,000 votes the first time. Same guy I ran against 2 years later, I beat him by 4,000 votes. And it was because I had shaken the hands or said hello to every voter possible in the city. And I had a whole list of them. And the longshoremen were very helpful to me. They didn't like that particular candidate, period. And they assigned a couple of people to walk with me. And so for almost 2 years, every time I had any free time, I was going ringing doorbells. And that paid off handsomely, and it carried me all the way through the mayorship.
So you won in 64. You get to Sacramento. You voted against the very powerful speaker and were in the doghouse for a bit, but you climb your way back.
No. I voted against a guy who had voted against me.
I knew I couldn't get through that.
He supported my opponent, the incumbent, which is what speakers should do. And so when it came time to vote, I didn't know that you shouldn't be voting against the head guy. And so when they got to my name, I said I voted against him. And John Burton was next in line.
And he did the same.
We're the best of friends. We went to law school together. We went to college together. He immediately voted. And then there was some crazy guy that we didn't know about. He was a PhD in economics named Bill Stanton. So his name, alphabetically, was way down the list, and he considered himself Superman. And he was regularly at odds with the speaker. And he suddenly discovered that he had two allies. That we didn't know we were his allies, but he voted with us. So 3 people, for the first time in the history, voted against Jess Unruh for speaker. Voted against him. And that meant you were given the worst assignments, the worst office space, the worst everything.
Yeah.
Period. And that worked out really well. Because in the process of assigning us, Jess made Burton his seatmate, which means Burton didn't really have a seatmate because Unruh was never at his desk. He gave me the guy who was an open racist, literally in the legislature, a guy named Ike Britsky from down somewhere in Santa Clara County. He made me sit with a Republican who he was punishing both of us. He was punishing me based on my having to sit with him and punishing him based on the fact that he had to sit with me. Well, that was my introduction, to a real live Republican. I had never been a real live Republican.
Well, let me pick up on that because your career in Sacramento, you made a lot of friends with a lot of Republicans, and they saved your bacon a few times too. What was it? Why did you go up there? And I don't know if you made friends with him in particular, but there were...
I did. Believe it or not, I did. I sat down next to him, and he said, "You know that I've never, ever been seated next to and he used the wrong term. So I said, "Nor have I." Where are they? and so he laughed, and we started to talk. And so he said, "I guess I don't know enough about black people. Why don't you tell me about them?" And I said, "I know nothing about white people. Why don't you tell me about them?" And we became friends literally. And he learned a lot, got elevated, and he voted. I think he may have voted so poorly representing his district that he ended up losing. Because I'd tell him how to vote. I knew he didn't read anything. I knew he didn't. So I would regularly tell him how to vote, and he enjoyed because it made him different from his other Republicans. And so it was a good working relationship.
For you.
Once you get out of the doghouse with the speaker, you end up as chair of what was then Ways and Means, I believe.
Well, wait a minute. I didn't really get in the doghouse.
We're going to be here all night, y'all.
I didn't really get in the doghouse. Unra was a very smart guy. I mean, like really super smart. He came to me and said, "You've done something no one else has ever dared do." I said, "What is that?" He said, "You voted against me." I said, "You spent all that money, 2 elections. You stopped me from getting up here to begin with, and now I'm here." So he said, "You're here, and with the nature of how you operate, you're probably going to be here a long time. So you're going to get some assignments. You make a decision about what you want, and you submit it, and I make the assignments. Just be clear. Nothing you submit are you going to get. Period. I'm going to put you where you can do, just like you sat next to Brisky. I want you to, enjoy meeting new people and being in new things." And sure enough, I got assigned to the health committee. Black guy chaired the health committee, Byron Rumford. And the health committee operated where there was a hearing, but the hearing had nothing to do with the decisions. The decisions were made the night before at a dinner to which I was never invited. So that's how the world worked at that time. But there was one guy on that committee named Leroy Green, an engineer from up in Sacramento. And Leroy had been on the health committee, and he had been mistreated consistently. He had a bill that he wanted, and no one wanted to pay attention to it. And it was a bill that would allow for determination at birth based upon an evaluation from some of the substance released from children that would be able to give you an idea of what adverse effect these kids had. In those days, we didn't have all the great scientific evaluation process. They'd never take his bill up, never let his bill out, and of course he mentioned it to me, and I, of course, made the motion to put his bill out. He seconded the motion, and that drove Byron Rumford crazy because suddenly he no longer had control because there were a couple of other people that couldn't vote no on Leroy's bill because it affected children, period. He assigned me to 2 or 3 other committees under similar circumstances, and I got lucky. The main one he assigned me to that was so great was for a guy named Jack Knox out of Richmond. Knox was the most skilled parliamentarian in the House, literally. So I learned how to be very good at using the rules under Jack Knox.
Yeah.
Period.
Well,
and it worked really well because by the time the year ended, I had been selected by the press as the most outstanding freshman legislator, and I had established a working relationship with a collection of people that I otherwise would never have been able, except when the challenge, how do you make it work? And I made it work.
We have a quote that you gave to, or was in a biography of you. I want to pull it up. It has to do with how you felt about working with Republicans and Democrats. I'm doing this out of order, Ryan. I apologize. Here it is. This is you. Actually, it was a KQED interview. It's always harder to work with liberals than conservative white folks. The liberals think they know your community, whereas a man like Ronald Reagan, you can embarrass him more easily. And whereas a Ronald Reagan recognizes and respects the blacks' own power structure, Jerry Brown is the type who reaches in and pushes his own man. Talk about the way you thought about race and Republicans, and how what you brought with you to Texas informed all of that, and because they were really instrumental in your success up there.
In the halls of the legislature, or in the halls of Congress, or any other body, the decisions are made by majority vote. And you don't want to limit yourself to anything other than trying to get a majority vote, period. And you really have to work at it. And you have to prove on every step of how dedicated and sincere and effective what you're advocating could be, regardless of the political persuasion or the registration of the people you're talking to or the individuals you're talking to. And you got to treat them all with the same kind of respect. Ones you don't treat with that kind of respect are the nuts, and there are usually a few of those, period. And you can identify them early on, but don't waste any time doing anything like trying to make sure they don't survive. Ignore them. But the other folk who might make up your majority, you got to work on them. You got to convince them, etc. And that's what I have always done. And I've never allowed, whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, to interfere with my trying to get you to vote for me.
I mean, your critics would say that you went after power at all cost. And I want to ask you about, well, we have a photo of you. You were known in, I think, the 70s and 80s for driving very nice cars up to Sacramento. Here is you with one of your Porsches, early days. There's a story in one of your bios where they talk about you being pulled over twice in one day by the CHP on the way up to Sacramento. And at the time, they were trying to get some money in their budget, I think, for some new guns. And you stopped it until I think the commissioner went out and showed everyone your photo and said, hey, don't pull this guy over. Critics might say, though, that didn't help any other black people, right? That helped Willie. I mean, talk about that. How do you think about those decisions? And to your mind, was that power important not just for you, but for the whole black community?
Well, first and foremost, I was elected by a district that had only 13% black people in it. And there's no reason in the world why any person so elected, if they intended to really be effective, would limit themselves to anything except the problems of the people of the district. Black, white, Asian, everything, men, women, and what have you. For an example, I had not focused at all on gay and lesbian issues. I went to seek the endorsement of an organization called SIR, Society for Individual Rights. There were white people, black people, some of everybody there. I showed up a little late, just behind Burton, but there were 5 other people who were trying to get endorsements as well. And each time they made their pitch, they then would close by discussing a measure, a new code that would address the issue in one manner or another by eliminating criminal penalties for sexual acts between consenting adults in private. And the police would go crazy. And so I finally asked Burton, what's creating all that? He said, he told me exactly what it was. I was not up to date on it. So I knew, however, that there were 400 items in that proposal, that measure. That was just one of the 400 items. And I knew that we politicians often say what we are sincere and we mean, but we're not prepared to sacrifice the other 300 or 400 for just that one. I knew that if this crowd was raising all kinds of great reaction that they were raising when you say, I will vote for the measure, that that's not good, because that measure is never going to be where you test the sincerity of that vote. So I decided, and I was the last speaker, I stood up and said, before we go any further, let me start with the thing that all of you are reacting to. The new evidence code that's being proposed has 400 items in it. You are reacting to only one. There's nowhere in the world that there's going to be an opportunity to vote for just that one unless somebody dumps the rest of them and takes that one up separately. That's what I'm going to do, and that's what I did.
How long did it take you?
I did that. And long before anybody was discussing gay and lesbians, all those things, I did that because that was the right thing to do. And that was not black, white, or otherwise. And it turned out to be a cornerstone in my existence because until Newsom in 2004 did the same-sex marriage approval, I had been the #1 person carrying all that, and I was prepared when Newsom did that to fire my whole staff. They should have gotten that from me. There's no way. There's no way. I should have been that many years later. But
how long did it take you to? Okay, sorry.
You got to understand that in the world of politics, you've got to represent your constituency. And in the process of representing your constituency, you can do all the things you need to do that will enhance your reelectability, your chance for advancement, and at the same time to address specifically the issues that affects components of your constituency. So not only did I do the one that I just talked about, I helped orchestrate with Maxine Waters carrying the bill that got Nelson Mandela out of jail by the business of divestment against investing in anybody doing business in South Africa. There are hundreds of similar examples where you don't want ever to be limited to just working on behalf of one component of the constituency which you hope to represent. When I became Speaker, I represented the state of California, literally, and I orchestrated the process in the same way. And there was never an occasion when there was any issue that affected specifically the lives of black people that I did not help orchestrate because I had Elihu Harris would get the assignment, Maxine Waters would get the assignment, Gwen Moore would get the assignment, and it was an assignment given to them by the leader, Willie Brown.
So, and I also want to give you credit, I think it was 1983, you were speaker at that time. You got the first money out of George Duke Machen into the budget for AIDS. It wasn't even called AIDS then.
Well, I got to tell you, it's always a great challenge to try to take people who are totally foreign to anything that you are advocating. And an opportunity might present itself, particularly if they have power. George Duke Machen was the governor of the state of California. We had a serious health problem that required serious money for purposes of research and what have you. And it was such that it didn't have a whole lot of friends, period. Duke Machen, however, had a great desire on a couple of items that represented something that was seriously important to him. The two of us had lunch together in the basement at the Capitol, and when we left lunch, I got the money for the research, and he got what he wanted.
Yeah.
Very simple, quid pro quo.
Yeah. I want to ask, you became speaker in 1980. You lost in 74. You won in 1980. And you did it with a lot of Republican votes. Marisa was asking about the very beginning of your career in politics with the NAACP and the protests. And as you got to Sacramento and accumulated more power, you moved to the middle, I think it's fair to say. There were some issues that you just talked about, where you were a staunch ally, but you took money from tobacco, you took money from banks, you took money from, a lot of corporate interests, trade interests, and there were people who felt that maybe there was a for sale sign on the Capitol. What's your response?
Well,
he's smiling.
I'm always amused by people who question how we politicians go about securing the resources that allows us to get elected, to help elect other people, to pass legislation, and to get the job done. You can do that without ever violating any rules or regulations. And the people who are so focused on their standard on the behavioral side, they're entitled to their level of criticism. But in the end, they ought to measure their absence of success by how they were unable to achieve whatever they achieved, but they ought to admire the ability of others to succeed, and some of whom they criticize, period. I was the beneficiary of the greatest volume of criticism ever, period. I was also probably the most effective person outside of Nancy Pelosi ever elected from San Francisco, period. Period. By comparison in every way. And at no point was there anybody who could ever say, I moved a piece of legislation because of a contribution. Jess Unruh had equipped me early on. He said, young man, you voted against me, but be clear. There's some things you may or may not know. One of the things you may not know is how to deal with contributions from people you don't know, from organizations that may be opposed to some of the things you're about. And they'll want to donate to you. Take the donation and then vote your conscience, period. And don't ever give that up. If you ever do, you shouldn't hold public office. So when I became the speaker, I decided to shield my membership from that kind of pressure. With David Roberti, the President Pro Tem of the Senate, I pulled him together and said, why don't we establish at the close of the legislative session, we ought to invite all of the special interest organizations that have registered as lobbying operations to visit with you and to visit with me, independent. We ought to tell each of them what we believe to be the people they ought to be supporting. They might have a difference based on whatever, and we ought to tell them that we really don't want them to give money that will create the image that somehow those people were corrupt. So I became one of the biggest fundraisers ever, because people in that world decided they didn't want to be criticized for giving money to somebody that may vote for their measure. So if they handed it off to me, to my account, I would be identified as the recipient, and everybody that had any clue knew that the honor edict was my guidepost on everything in the halls of the legislature dealing with the way in which you raise money for purposes of getting people elected. I suspect that Nancy Pelosi would echo the comments that I make in that regard, because she had to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars to get her people elected to make sure she won the job that she gets as the Speaker of the House. When they didn't do that, they lost the majority. I never lost the majority.
The FBI thought that you were on the take, though, and they launched at one point an undercover investigation that was actually put into motion by a Republican who then got caught up in the investigation himself. I mean, it's wild. The whole thing is wild. Talk about that. This was an attempt by them to run a bill for a shrimp company, and they just started trying to hand out like envelopes of cash. One of your staff members got one like left on her doorstep and gave it back.
No, not inaccurate. You're talking about Karen Sonoto. My instructions to my staff people, implementable and enforced by maybe the most important staff person ever in my life, a woman named Eleanor Johns. She worked for me for more than 40 years. She handled everything connected with money in my world, including my own resources. My members of my family disliked intensely having to get money from Eleanor. But Eleanor had the responsibility to handle every aspect of whatever money, political and otherwise. And as a matter of fact, she died about a month, 2 weeks ago, and I'm still arguing with the bank because I, in the last month, started signing the checks, and the checks didn't clear because she had been signing my name all those years, and we're now working that out. But Eleanor was so religious and so focused and so dedicated, she made sure that the issue of money and how it got moved or not moved. The Republicans who assisted me in becoming Speaker did so, I think, with the idea that in a very short period of time, no black guy is going to be able to run something as important as the legislature, period, and that I would screw it up. I didn't at all. They fought among themselves on the basis for a long period of time, and they finally decided, wait a minute, why don't we see if we can't set it up so that he ends up getting prosecuted. And they set about, talked to the FBI, a fellow named Nolan, Patrick Nolan was the Republican head of the House at that time, and he told the FBI that he thinks that Willie Brown's a crook, and that he would like to help them get me. And he started to work for them. Every week he'd report to them. About the third or fourth week, some smart FBI guy said, you know, there's something wrong because everything he's told us has been inconsistent with reality. None of it is proven true. He may be covering something up. He went to jail. He went to jail because he didn't do what I had done and what Eleanor enforced. The item you reference was a fundraising event, $1,000 a person. Lou Rawls was performing, was in Sacramento, black tie, and I gave the best parties. I mean, the absolute, I gave parties like you wouldn't believe, fundraising parties, and people loved attending. And the staff people were instructed specifically, you never, ever take any cash contributions from anybody, your mother, your father, nobody. These two FBI guys who are running this shrimp deal sees this Japanese lady, find out where she lives, and showed up at her house, waited for her when she came home, and said, we want to buy 2 tickets to the party that Speaker Brown is having. And she says, not a problem. They said, here. She said, no, we don't do cash. They said, well, we'd like to pay. She said, there's a SNL right down the street. See it? Go down there and get they call it a
cashier's check.
Cashier's check or some other form, and bring it back, and I'll get you 2 tickets. Sure enough, they did. They brought it back. She got him 2 tickets. And she was proud of herself for having sold 2 tickets without any issue. About a month later, now I filed a campaign, Eleanor filed a campaign report listing the names given. Lo and behold, a month later, the Sacramento Bee listed those 2 names as being part of a scam operation put for the FBI in order to nail people. I had filed my campaign report put together by Eleanor, and I'd listed those scam names. I held a press conference, and I announced that just what I told you about how that money came to reach my coffers. And I was asked, and do you intend to return it? Of course not. They attended the party. What I do intend to do is I intend to change the name of the donors and place the FBI as being, so on my campaign report is the name of the FBI having donated $2,000 to me. They never, ever again, never bothered to go after Willie Brown. They went after a lot of other people, but they gave up. And then when one of the FBI guys, many years later, I guess he was retiring or something, but he came, I'm now the mayor. He came to City Hall. I didn't even know who he was. And my office said that there's a guy that said he's formerly an FBI man, and he'd like to say hello to you. Well, oh my God, is he alone?
Is he wearing a wire?
Yeah. No, just, and he said, yeah, he's alone. Oh, well, send him in. I see everybody. So he comes in, and he said, I want to give you a gift. I said, what is the gift? And it was a cap that said FBI. I said, why are you giving me the cap? He said, I'm retired now, and there's a cap that I wore. And I wore that cap all the time that we were trying to get you. We gave up, he said, we gave up because we decided that either you're the most honest person we've ever tried to get, or you're the smartest. But either way, we didn't get you.
Yeah. Well,
And
you were.
so-
Go ahead. Sorry.
And so that was one incident. And then another occasion, I'm at City Hall. My office said, there is a guy from the U.S. Attorney's Office that wants to see you. I said, is he alone? And he said, yes, he is. Mueller came in to see me. He said, I have been identified by President Bush to take over the FBI in D.C., and that has to be approved by Democrats in the Senate. I would like very much if you would give a letter of support to get me appointed, to get me approved. And I said, I certainly will. It's not a problem for me. But you sure you want me? He said, absolutely. He said, you know, I've been the U.S. Attorney for a long time here, and you've been running a good operation, really a good operation. And I knew of you from Sacramento, and I think the Democrats would be impressed that you would be supporting me, period. I said, but it'll cost you more to explain your relationship with me. Because people would assume that I'm looking out for myself, that at some point I may need to call on you. He laughed, and we had fun with that. I told him that I'd be happy to come to D.C. and testify. That'll be the only way. I would not write him a letter. You got to put my name on the list. He did. He put my name on the list of people to testify. And then, of course, Diana and Barbara agreed that they would sign off on his becoming the person, and the Democrats in the Senate agreed, and it eliminated the need for me to come so testify. So over the years, no matter what was suspected or implied, the product and the result of those kind of efforts is very clear.
Yeah.
Nonetheless,
I'm still out of jail.
you are, but there are others that you brought into government. Mohammed Nehru, who you brought in when you were mayor. Ed Lee promoted him. The Kellys, Harlan Kelly and Naomi Kelly, got caught up in another FBI investigation that some think Ed Lee was really the original target of. These are, and as you say, you know, you've never been convicted or even charged with anything. Did they not get the? Were they not there when you explained to them how to, you know, keep out of trouble?
I frankly have no idea. I don't know why anybody connected with government at any point would do anything that might get them time or get them discredited in some fashion. The one thing that my family, when I left Mineola, I was sent to San Francisco. I didn't come here. I didn't know anything about San Francisco. I knew I had 2 uncles out here, but I knew absolutely nothing. My mother was certain that my life would not be a good life to be living in Texas. And all she said was, go on out there, but don't let those uncles teach you anything like your grandmother did. I want you never, ever to do anything that would embarrass you, me, or any member of the family. And that was a deal that I made with my mother. I think that people ought to have some center point or some guideline or some guidepost that they really embrace, and let that be the guidepost. you cannot benefit from any crookedness, in my opinion, period. And you don't ever have that happen unless somewhere that guidepost that you had didn't work.
Well, before we let you go, I want to talk a couple current politics. I'm curious, you know, San Francisco is getting a lot of negative attention right now nationally. Fox News were their favorite to put on, and you know, there's a lot of challenges in the city, big ones. Some have existed for decades. How do you see San Francisco right now? What, you know, you've been here since 1951, as we established.
I love San Francisco. I don't even like to go to Oakland or any other city. I really do. I walk a lot in the city. I visit everything that is going on in the city. I've pretty much been a part of it since the first day I arrived. My uncle started me walking. I got here, the first thing he said was, I can't be of any help to you because I'm not educated, and your mother wants you to be educated, and I don't know much about the city. So why don't you just take some money off to dresser every morning and go in a different direction in the city. And if you get back, you'll get dinner. If you don't get back, you're on your own. And that's my exposure to the city. And all that did was walk everywhere. I went to see everything that could be seen. And in spite of the current circumstances that has engulfed the city, we just did not fully appreciate the need to make the city inclusive. In other words, we never should have had the business world isolated from the people in San Francisco. We were so pleased with how much the people who come to the city every day, and we treated them, frankly, better than the people who lived in the city in terms of how we reached out. When they stopped coming to the city, it adversely affected us like no other. We went from being a city of 1.8 million, 5 days a week, to 1,800,000, 5 days a week, to being only 800,000 because the millions went to the other 8 counties surrounding us, period. And at that time, they didn't have access to all the things that they get full time because they went home only for 2 days. They went home for 2 days on the weekend. The other 5 days they spent here. And we lived large with their presence here, with what they spent and what have you. Then we started to build to accommodate them instead of building in a way that would have us where when nighttime comes, the streets will be just as packed and crowded and alive as the daytime. We didn't do that. We literally, a long time ago, started to think seriously about separating. I suspect not until I did Mission Bay. When I served as mayor, I did Mission Bay. I created that whole community down there in Mission Bay. And I started by saying, I want to build where you walk to work. I want to build where I don't need to invest in a whole lot of money in transportation. I want to build where I don't have to do a whole lot of other things on the safety side. And I did Mission Bay, literally. 6,900 residential units, 1,700 of them built on an affordable basis for the people who work and can't pay the high rate and what have you. And they had to be built before you built any of the research labs, any of the hospitals, any of the things down there that is in Mission Bay. We don't even talk about how much we love Mission Bay. Nobody talks about how safe they feel in Mission Bay.
Should bring up a picture. We got a picture of you with the governor at the opening of Chase Center, actually.
Yeah, and I'm mad at Chase Center.
Go on.
Chase Center should have been at Pier 32. That's where Chase Center should have been. We have disrupted a piece of Mission Bay with a fabulous place called Chase Center, but it was because we succumbed to the idea that they shouldn't be on Pier 32. I orchestrated and got the voters to approve building the Giants baseball park on pier land, on land that when the Giants finish in another 10 or 12 years, we own the stadium. Because they are tenants. They're not,
Right.
that Chase Center ought to be at Pier 32. It never should have been in the last piece of land left in Mission Bay. And we, I did the T-line that goes all the way out.
Down 3rd Street.
That is correct. It's all because we didn't envision the city the way it should have been envisioned. We never should have done what we did to the city when we decided to let all these commercial structures push everything out of the way, period. So now what do we have? We have 5 or 6 wonderful neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods, now you actually do your restauranting in the neighborhoods. You do your bar hopping in the neighborhoods. You do all those kinds of things. But that's not all of what the city ought to be about. Period. And believe me, this city will come back to being a fabulous place, but it will not be tarred with all of the nonsense that we keep reading about and writing about. And I'm angry with the Chronicle. Why would the Chronicle do its best to paint this city in such a way that they qualify for finalists for the Pulitzer Prize on the basis of our problem with homelessness and on the basis of the problem we have with drugs? That newspaper ought to be pushing us in every way to make this city what Willie Brown found when he got here in 1951, and what many other people found when they got here, even pre-51 and post-51. It's absolutely insane, in my opinion, to be doing what many people who are here are allowing to happen with their quotes and their comments and their conduct. I said and got criticized for it. Back in 97, I said, when I used to do those summits, I was going to do a summit on homelessness. But as always, I really studied the issue in great detail, just as I did for the first hooker that I represented. And I concluded that you can't deal with homelessness without dealing with those things that prompts homelessness: mental health, unemployment, poverty, all those things. I said, so we need to get legal authority to have you take your meds, whether you want to or not, so that you can manage your own life. And then we ought to help you manage your life. We needed to do things like that, but we are so interested, apparently, in doing things differently and by the teachings of the social workers world that we allowed ourselves to be charmed in that way. I said homelessness needs that kind of legislative attention, that kind of national attention from the feds. So I'm not going to hold a summit on homelessness. It can't be done, literally. I would tell you that how can people use some of their wealth to buy tents? Do you know that part of the homeless people on the streets have been given tents by some of our elected officials? That's awful. That's contributing to what we ought to be trying to totally and completely eliminate.
Mayor Willie Brown, we got to leave it there. Thank you for coming in.
Should we ask the quick 2024 question or no?
Thank you all for coming. We want to thank Ryan Davis for putting this whole thing together, Johan Martinez, Danny Sarkar, Jim Bennett, and the whole live team. Thanks to you all for joining this live edition of Political Breakdown. You can learn more about other live shows at kqed.org/live. And don't forget to tune into our show, Political Breakdown. It runs on KQED Thursday nights at 6:30 of Public Radio. You can always get it on your podcast feed, and we're going to be featuring this conversation soon. So thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming.